All right. Happy Tuesday. I am Michael Lucas with the MacIver Institute. I am a policy analyst. I am joined today by someone who is very good on property rights, energy, all things Fed nuisances and whatnot. We're going to be talking about energy policy today and an alternative policy for Wisconsin and the United States to pursue. This is sort of an episode of the MacIver Report. Maybe not. Maybe it's a new podcast. I don't know. It could be called Mic'd Up with Mike. I think that's a little catchy, but we'll see. In any case, treat it as a bonus episode. So we're still going to do a MacIver Report on Friday. So, Richard, would you mind telling us a little about yourself?
Well, I'm Richard Moore, and for the past 20 plus years, I've been an investigative reporter with the Lakeland Times in Minocqua, northern Wisconsin. And through that time, I've been able to produce a few books, Dark State, about the lack of transparency in Wisconsin government, how the DNR stole Wisconsin. That's an old one, but always a good one. When you're talking about the DNR, they're still trying to steal Wisconsin, by the way. They've never stopped. They went underground a few years when Walker was governor, but now they're back. And then the new bossism of the American left. And I guess the best way to introduce myself in terms of politics is that my big concern, and this goes into the heart of what we're going to be discussing today in terms of energy, is bureaucracy. I think I'm a believer that bureaucracy is the dictator, essentially, and runs the government, owns the state. And we have to, if we're going to reclaim the republic, we're going to have to get rid of the bureaucracy, all but the most bare-boned core functions of government that we can. And I just, in very, very short, if I may, as a way of introduction, I came out of the left when I was a college student way back when. I was part of the socialist left, University of South Carolina. And then when I graduated, I went to New York and joined the socialist movement and became part of the Socialist Party, labor movement, worked in labor movement jobs. But the reason I mention this is because it has great relevance on bureaucracy. There was a fellow called Max Shachtman, and I would urge everybody to look him up. He was a communist in his early days, and he went to Russia, and he became friends with Lenin, but he really became friends with Trotsky. Leon Trotsky became a Trotskyist. And they had the falling out with Lenin and then later with Stalin. And then, of course, Trotsky had to run for his life until they took it from him in Mexico. But Shachtman went all the way with him. And Shachtman came back to the United States. He founded the Socialist Workers' Party. And then he kept moving to the right. And he moved into the Socialist Party. And he was just a mainstream Democrat, but a Scoop Jackson Cold Warrior Democrat by the time he died. And he wrote a book called The Bureaucratic Revolution, and everybody should read it because it informs, and I had a great conversation late in his life, way back in the 70s, where he told me that's going on in the United States today and we need to look out for it. He wrote it about the Soviet Union, that there was no worker state, there was no deformed worker state, that the bureaucracy was the dictator. And it happens in communist states, it happens in totalitarian states, and it happens in democratic states. And so it informed my whole intellectual journey and travel to conservative politics, but I still hold it very, very very close to my chest that bureaucracy is the problem. And I think we'll see that that's a huge part of the problem when we discuss energy policy today.
Well, we have a lot of things in common, I'm realizing. I'm from California, so I sort of have an excuse for my we at least have that in common, in that we have gone the other way.
Travel the spectrum, right?
But yeah, I'm really looking forward to what you have to say about bureaucracy. So, all right, so let's get into it. So, energy economics, policy of energy. I want to start with just a brief history of energy and how man has used energy throughout the course of his existence. Um, and there's a really great book by E.A. Wrigley which talks about this. Talks about the first, or sort of the original factor of energy available to man, and then innovations or discoveries that come to us along the way throughout our journey on this mortal coil, so to speak. And the first, that original factor is labor from men and labor from animals. You only find this energy source in the most primitive of economies. And more advanced economies discover through technology, through imitation from other peoples that they meet from other parts of the world, or just original thought, that they can save labor by finding alternative sources of energy. And one of the first alternative sources of energy was harnessing the wind. And so you get the windmill, and the windmill pops up in Europe. And then, as sort of a variation on that theme, you then get the watermill. Water, much more dependable than wind in terms of turning a mill or running a mill, because so long as you have a tributary and you've got enough snow melt, then there's going to be enough power in the river that you're harnessing in order to turn your mill. And these are pre-industrial forms of energy. Of course, the industrial era begins with the discovery and use of coal. Since that time, now in the industrial age, other versions of coal, other versions of fossil fuels have made up the bulk of the energy that we consume and that we use in order to power our lives and power our economies. So we have crude oil, found in on the ocean floor and under land. We have the invention of kerosene with Rockefeller. Much more recently, with the advent of fracking and horizontal drilling, we have liquefied natural gas, and we have shale coal and all sorts of other fossil fuels that are much more densely packed with energy. And at the same time, we also have advancements in some of those older sources of energy like wind and solar. And the most energy dense source we have discovered to date has been nuclear. And we're going to talk a lot about nuclear later, but it is really these three things that mark or signify an industrial economy. It's the use of energy dense fuels, abundant energy dense fuels. And you find that in the form of fossil fuels and nuclear. And some people believe wind and solar, but it's all bogus. And we'll show you why that is. So just to really drive this home, this chart shows the energy density per kilogram of the energy resource. So say you had a kilogram of wind, it would produce 0.00006 megajoules. Okay, water is 0.72. Already thousands of orders of magnitudes greater than wind. So you can imagine that moving from a wind turbine moving from a windmill to a watermill is just a marked and drastic improvement in the standard of living for people who have that technology available. Then you have wood. You find wood being used in most of Africa today, in many parts of Asia, outside of Korea and Japan, but in Mongolia and wherever else, if it's not China, Japan, South Korea, people are using wood, are using refuse from animals. Animal dung is a very common form of energy in Africa. Huge improvement to wind and to water, especially for Africans where there isn't a lot of water available and their major river runs totally dry for more than half the year. And then you have petroleum products, 50 megajoules of per kilogram. I mean, this is more than 50-fold greater than the energy you could harness from water. Then hydrogen fuel, not as common today. And then at the very bottom, of course, you got nuclear fission. That's what is what we use in our nuclear reactors. You get 88 million megajoules from 1 kilogram of refined uranium. 1 kilogram of uranium, by the way, is $90. So this is, if you, just to, Richard, maybe
I
you'll
know.
agree with me on this, but I can't remember who said it. Someone asked a hypothetical question. They said, "Oh, if you went back in time to 1880 or whatever, pick a date, and you said, hey, right now you guys use wind and water, and this is how much energy you get from these. But in the future, you're also going to have this stuff called gasoline or crude oil, and you'll get this much energy. And you also have wind and solar panels, which will harvest energy from the sun. That's how much energy you'll get from this. And then you'll also have this thing called nuclear energy, and you'll get 80 million times more energy from nuclear. Which one of those do you think that your descendants are going to be using 100 years from now?" And obviously the answer is that one, the nuclear.
Nuclear.
And that's not the case at all. At all. It's not even close. We have such a fear and a phobia of nuclear for good reason. But this is a fear and a phobia that
Well, the fear and phobia has been driven politically, and I think so. I actually don't think it's for good reason. I think caution and due diligence is reasonable, but the phobia and the fears we'll talk about when we get into nuclear is just outrageous. It's the safest form of energy there can be. Be honest with you, and has proven it time and again, and it needs to be unshackled, unleashed, so we can derive the energy potential at low cost if we let it, if we level the playing field, and we'll get into that too.
Yeah. So continuing with that, here's what we do in Wisconsin. So if you look at that top line there, this shows the source of energy for the electricity that we produce. Most of it's coming from coal. We have coal powered facilities all throughout Wisconsin. We're getting rid of them. South Oak Creek, as you know, shut down one or two of its units there. Natural gas is huge, 33%. Just under 6% comes from renewable energy. That's water, wind, and solar. And also biofuel, I think, is counted in there. And then 20% comes from nuclear. Now, we have one nuclear plant here in the state of Wisconsin, producing 20% of all the electricity that the state consumes. Think about it. So, Richard, maybe you could say a little bit about this and energy's purpose.
Well,
what's the purpose of energy? Why is this so important?
Well, as you point out on the screen there, this is the lifeblood of a society, of an economy, and what to me. Energy is about prosperity. It's about innovation and liberation. If we have energy, we can be prosperous, we can be productive, we can be creative. It liberates us to do more in less time. It gives us modern conveniences. And so we often hear, and to home in on that, as you put here, all economic activity requires physical, chemical energy. And at the present time, and talking about energy being the limiting factor for wealth creation, it certainly is, because the other side of the coin is the lack of energy, the lack of productive energy is the mark of poverty. And we see that now in, say, the continent of Africa, where you still have 600 million people, nearly half or slightly more than half, that don't have electricity on a continent. They emit less than 2% of the greenhouse gases on Earth today, but they're loaded with fossil fuels. And I'd like to get to that point, is that fossil fuels right now is the energy form that is the key to our wealth. And Mike, you said it earlier, is that, the mark of an industrial society is the use of these kind of fossil fuel industries. Well, The mark of deindustrialization is when we don't use them, when we when we try to go back in time to wind and solar, back to cave times, to net zero. Now we see our own country hollowed out, its manufacturing gates closed and shifted so they can pollute in India and China, and our cities and towns are bankrupt. So deindustrialization, more poverty comes with this so-called quote unquote cleaner fuel. Fossil fuels have delivered. And when they talk about all the dire climate change predictions that come with fossil fuels, which haven't come to pass, they don't talk about the benefits, of what we have gained. And we live longer, we're healthier, we have more materially comfortable and productive lives. There's a book out there called Fossil Future. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, by
Alex Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the points that he makes in this book is death by climate disaster. Flood, we've just seen the climate disaster in Los Angeles, but hurricanes, all of this. Well, in the last 100 years, those climate disaster related deaths have declined by 98%. You have 50 times fewer chance of dying in a climate related disaster now than you did 100 years ago. And the reason for that, he points out, is fossil fueled driven machines and technology and the advances that fossil fuels have given us. And we're foolish and crazy if we don't embrace fossil fuels. I'm not going to sit here and say that belching fossil fuels into the environment is necessarily a good thing that we want to produce. But it certainly isn't. We're not in a doomsday scenario where we have to crater our standard of living and destroy our economy. So when we get back to the original point of what is energy for, it's for unleashing human potential. That's what it's for. It's for prosperity. And the shame of it all is that we have enough energy, fossil fuel energy right now, to make all the world prosperous if we let them produce it. And that's what we need to do.
Yeah. So here's how we can do that. So in my mind, if we're going to have a policy, a public policy position about energy, these should be our goals. First one should be that energy needs to be abundant. We need to have a lot of it. We have 330 million people in this country. We've got, what are we at, 9 billion, almost 10 billion now worldwide. Every single one of these people relies on energy intensely in their day-to-day lives. When I went on Vicki McKenna's show a few months ago, and I was talking about, the renewable energy movement, the green movement, right? This fetish for wind and solar power in Wisconsin, of all places. One of the points that I made was that, if these people get their way, I really hope that you have a fireplace in your home. And I really hope that you have some trees in your backyard. And I really hope that you have an axe that you can swing, because that's
You're
what
going to need it.
Right? I mean, your home is heated by gas, okay? Or you have an electric water heater. Where does this stuff come from? It doesn't come from the outlet. It comes from power plant. So in my mind, abundance is the first thing. And if it's abundant, then you almost automatically, you check off the second, ideal of energy policy, which is that it's affordable. Of course, I'll talk a little bit more about affordability and how this renewable energy stuff just blows that goal out of the water based on the incentives that are faced by utility companies who provide us with their energy. And then the third thing is reliability. What do you want from your energy? You want a lot of it, you want it cheap, and you want it when you need it. That should be the goal of an energy policy, in my mind. Anything that I'm missing there, Richard?
No, I think you got it. Those
Okay.
are the three key components.
Right. It's always nice when these lists, can be narrowed down to three. Okay. So if that's your ideal, let's contrast that with what current energy policy is. Richard, you know a lot about this. So where do you want to start? You want to start with federal, or you want to start with state?
Well, I'm going to kind of gloss over. Maybe you can come back to the federal. I think I'll just touch on the federal bureaucracy, the Department of Energy, the reason I'm going to just gloss over it a bit is because the Trump administration, I think, is doing a superb job so far of trying to get its arms around the energy bureaucracy. You got the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You've got regulatory commissions for all of it coming out, the tentacles coming out of the Department of Energy. And there's so much entangled in terms of, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, all of this playing together in these massive umbrella policies like the Clean Air Act, Clean Power, all of this feeding subsidies and regulations, subsidies to the renewables and the green energy plan and regulation of fossil fuels, all of this huge giant bureaucracy, which has been designed, and particularly since the Obama years, but during the Bush years too, to take down fossil fuels and to promote renewables. And it really gained steam during the Obama years when he put his thumb on the subsidy scale. But when we get down, I think we're going to be seeing one of Trump's early executive orders was unleashing energy resources.
Yeah.
And he's taken some very solid steps there to gain those under control. What most people don't understand is, or realize is that a lot of these regulations and subsidies that come out of Washington are then built into state bureaucracies. And so a lot of the energy policy and implementation actually happens on the state level. And we talk about nuclear. If we have more nuclear energy in Wisconsin, it isn't going to come from Washington. Washington may allow it to happen if we get rid of the subsidies for renewables and unravel the regulations. But it will happen only if and when we have the ability, the capability, and the will to do it on the state level. Right now, our bureaucracy is stacked the other way. There is a multitude of agencies and offices that are dealing with energy regulations. Right off the bat, you can talk about the Public Service Commission and the regulation of utilities and its tilt toward monopoly. You can talk about the DNR and everything from controlling energy through large livestock operations or pipelines like Line 5 up in northern Wisconsin. DNR is a huge energy agency as well as a anti-property rights agency, and I think we'll talk about that goes hand in hand. But you've also got these silly offices that some of them created by Evers, the Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy, the Office of Environmental Innovation, Focus on Energy. And so all of these things are laying out obstacles to productive use of power and lathering subsidies where they shouldn't be lathered. And one of the big legislative efforts that we could undertake in conjunction with private property rights, I think, over the next couple of years in the state is to unravel the state bureaucracy, particularly because it is a real impediment to affordable and reliable energy in the state of Wisconsin.
Is the DNR sort of the bulldog of these energy bureaucracies in the state? Is it the most significant one?
It is the most significant one.
Yeah.
It has the most regulatory clout. It has the most aggressive bureaucrats to carry out their policies. Some of these offices, and I mentioned they were kind of silly. The Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy. This is just handing out treats and favors to favored industries, subsidies, tax breaks, whatever we can, grants, federal grants, how can we marshal that? And their fancy DEI offices as well, kind of dressed up in various names. But the DNR comes down to it makes the decisions if they decide they want to pursue CAFO regulations. They're the ones where that firepower is coming from. The same thing with the oil pipelines through northern Wisconsin, which they recently permitted, but I'm not sure there's not an ulterior motive there in terms of to spark a lawsuit, which it has, to try to shut the pipeline down. And so we have to watch about, sue and settle lawsuits too. But that's the beehive. It's where the activity and the really policy development comes from. And a lot of these bureaucrats have been there for years and years and spent their times in their cubicles writing all this and preparing for these days.
What do they want? What's their MO? I mean, is it power for power's sake? Is it, personal enrichment? Are they ideological?
They're ideological. Well, it's all of the above. I think you start out with ideological. I think a lot of these bureaucrats, particularly in the DNR, are frankly deluded. I think they're true believers. They believe this stuff. And they get a sense of righteousness and power, and sort of dare anybody to challenge them. Obviously, it's power for power's sake. I mean, a lot of this. I mentioned the book "How the DNR Stole Wisconsin," but you can take a timeline way back when they tried to come in, and they're all about taking land. They want all of northern Wisconsin off limits to any commercial residential development, except to be a private playland for the elite, meaning Democratic Party apparatchiks and judges. And then so they wanted to take land, and that's been their whole MO all along, because they know if you control land and later energy, you control the society. So the early days, back during the Doyle days, they came up with this plot that all the wetlands were really lake beds. Very important distinction, because wetlands can be privately owned, lake beds are state owned. And so they magically transferred tens of thousands of acres into state ownership overnight. And it was a significant, they shut down cranberry operations. And a guy bought a house, and before he bought the house, he went to the DNR and said, is that a wetland or a lake bed? Because if it's a wetland, I'm going to be if it's a lake bed, I'm going to be non-conforming. And they said, it's obviously a wetland. You're no problem. And so then he said, well, can you give me a letter to that effect? Yeah, sure, we'll give you a letter. He gave him a letter. So this guy retires, one of the old DNR. And a few years later, the homeowner wanted to build a mother-in-law cottage in the back. And the local zoning people said, hey, you better check with the DNR, whether that's lake bed or wetland. And he said, no, I got a letter. They said, you better check. So he went back to the DNR, and the new DNR person came out there and said, that's lake bed. You're non-conforming. You're done. And he said, no, I got a letter. And she looked at him and said, that letter is not worth the paper it is written on. And they went to court, and he lost. Courts, it was all challenged in Dane County back then. But anyway, they went from that to shoreland zoning, particularly in the north. And now the latest bid is conservation easements, and taking all this land, the 56,000 acres and Pelican River easement. It's all throughout. It's not just northern Wisconsin. It's more heavily noticed and recognizable in northern Wisconsin. They work hand in hand with the Board of Commissioners of Public Land, which shouldn't have any land. That's unconstitutional. And so the whole power play is to control the land. And once they control the land, and they will control the energy production on the land. And I think it's largely ideological driven, but as with any bureaucracy, it's bureaucracy driven, meaning it's bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake and power for power's sake. And this is the way we control it.
Yeah. I'm reminded by, I think it's Tolstoy. It's either Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground. the retired bureaucrat who says that he did everything he did just to spite them.
Yes.
He so hated humanity. He just did everything he could to make their lives miserable and embraced it fully. Well, in any case, so DNR, Department of Energy, utility companies. Obviously, we see with our own eyes that they are doing this. They are grabbing land. Tom Tiffany just yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, gave a talk talking about agricultural land, farmland being converted for solar farms. It seems clear that they are all on the bandwagon for climate change, global warming, got to go renewables, solar, wind, biofuel, hydro, if they can, get away with it without killing any fish.
Right.
California wasn't on board. They cared about their trout and their bass too much, I guess. Even though none of these people have ever been fishing in their lives and don't know anything about conservation.
Exactly.
So that seems pretty clear. So that's the first reason that I can, see is that the reason they're doing this is they have an earnest belief in climate change, right? These are the core ideologues that you're talking about in these bureaucracies. So especially with younger folks too. I mean, there's a whole culture for millennials and younger is that we're the last generation, right? We're the last who are, going to live on this earth. Everything is coming to an end. We didn't start the fire. It was always burning, but that sort of thing. Is there any merit to this?
Well, I think there's two. You make a good point. I think there's two layers of differentiation. One of the younger people and younger generations, and let's not forget they've been indoctrinated since the day they walked into a government school. And it was
which must be the case because I had conservative parents and I came out a little socialist.
me too. Me too. And so, I mean, the indoctrination is there, and the climate indoctrination over the last 10, 15, 20 years has been just amazing. It wasn't too long ago. Sometimes I think things happened 2 weeks ago. It was actually 12 years ago. But the DNR was putting together these climate change books based on already at the time discredited United Nations IPCC climate change models. There's going to be the temperature is going to rise by 20 degrees in northern Wisconsin by the year 2030. It was just nonsense.
Yep.
But they distributed these books to school teachers free of charge, of course. Make this part of your classroom curriculum. Well, at the Lakeland Times, we got wind of it and started writing stories. And at the time, thankfully, it was the Walker administration and Kathy Stepp was running the agency, and they got rid of them. I think they're probably back now. I haven't really checked for sure, but it's the kind of indoctrination. They work hard. They work very hard to go into the classroom and indoctrinate. So you have people come on that actually believe this stuff, though I do think that at the very top, the elite, they don't believe it at all. They know nuclear power is safe. They know it's efficient. They know it solves the climate issue, the climate crisis, and that's why they're opposed to it, because if the climate crisis goes away, they got to find another crisis. And so they don't really, but that's at the very top. I think at the power centers, they know, but they've done a really good job of indoctrinating a large swath of the population.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
I included a graph here. This is data from, I can't remember if it's called the Central London temperature record or the Central England temperature record. But the green line in the middle, that's the average annual temperature recorded in London going back before 1667 up through 2024, I think is when I downloaded this. And this is an ongoing record. And what do you see there? You see R squared 0.2, which means there's a fairly significant positive upward trend in global temperature. Now, this is just coming from England. So, look at your NASA satellite thermal imaging data and you'll get a better idea. But below that, there's a blue line, which are winter temperatures, average winter temperatures. And above that, the orange line is average summer temperatures. And what do you see with the orange line? The R squared is 0.02, which means what? Summer temperatures haven't been changing since before 1667.
67.
But looking at that blue line there, the R squared is 0.1, which means what? That winters are getting warmer. So summers aren't getting warmer, winters are getting warmer. And what's that doing to the average annual temperature? Average annual temperature is going up. So this is a sort of thing that is omitted. There are many things that are omitted when you're talking about climate science. But this is a sort of analysis that ought to be taught to kids in order to make sense of the data. Where these kids have a belief that things are getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and Wisconsin's going to go up by what, 20 degrees Celsius? Is that what you said?
Yeah, something like that. I don't quote me on the exact figure, but it was
Celsius, Fahrenheit. But I think I remember Evers citing that figure as well when he, passed his executive order for, utilities to increase their renewable portfolio requirements, their renewable ratios in their energy mixes. But that leads one to believe that we're going to be living in an inferno.
An inferno, yes. And it's not true. When you take a look at the IPCC reports, and by the way, the last time I checked, which wasn't all that long ago, maybe 6 months ago, the IPCC studies that Wisconsin uses, the DNR basis always analysis on, was like 10 years old, unless they've updated them very recently. And the IPCC has updated its own numbers. But a couple of points about that, Mike. I mean, number one, if we talk about warming, slightly warming, how much of it is human induced and how much of it is cyclical and natural. And but a warming of 1 to 1.5 degrees is beneficial to the earth, not detrimental to the earth. It makes areas that now are almost impossible to have productive agriculture, can have productive agriculture. And so we should look at it in that light. But I think but you're looking at those studies, the most alarmist of the so-called scientists, climate scientists, the consensus, as they say, they cite the worst case scenarios, the worst probabilities, rather than those with any medium level confidence, which are not so dire or dramatic at all. And so the question is, and even in their own, I think if you read the fine print, even the IPCC says, well, even if we do net zero all the way across the board, which isn't going to happen, the impact is less than 2 degrees Celsius in a perfect world. In their perfect world, I could take issue with those, but in their perfect world. So why do we want to crater the entire economy for a scenario that even the IPCC really concedes isn't catastrophic?
Yeah.
I mean,
and this ties in well with climate change as well, which is this idea that if the status quo is maintained, our dependency on fossil fuels, then the pollution problem, begging the question, is going to get even worse. How does private property resolve this issue if we suppose that pollution is a significant, economic harm or a health harm? Specifically pollution from fossil fuels?
Well, I think if we allow private property, full private property rights, and we deregulate private property, people are naturally good stewards of the land. I mean, if you have a property, if you take care of it, right? I mean, it's yours. You want to have a comfortable place to live or to work. And I think what that does in the human spirit in terms of private property is the ability to have identity and the ability to dream. I can do this with my land. I can produce with this. I can be creative with my own skills and my land. And that becomes important because you then tend to put the land to the highest and best use. You don't put it to what the government considers as the highest and best use. You don't put it to what any corporation may come in and say is the highest best use, or any environmental group. And so what we have then will be a true market testing of the various alternative energies, all the energies, all of the above, to see which one takes us to the goal we are all striving to achieve, and that is a clean environment. We want clean air and we want clean water.
Mm-hmm.
And when we let the market work, before the Obama administration, before we had all the regulatory subsidies for renewables and alternative energy, the market moved slightly away from fossil fuels and toward renewable energies. The problem for environmentalists was it wasn't moving fast enough, and it wasn't going to move fast enough because it can't move fast enough. It wasn't developed, and so to force feed it, you do more harm than good. You actually probably extend the life of fossil fuels, so I think that in terms of private property, we remove the distortions from the market, meaning tax breaks and subsidies, and I include in that the oil subsidies for oil and gas, level the playing field, remove, on the other hand, the regulations that hold those energy sources with promise back, and let the people use their land to produce energy, whether individually or in communities or by state, the way the people want to do. And I think that's how private property goes hand in hand with energy and development.
Yeah. And especially with pollution, I an example that I like to talk about when I'm talking about, I taught economics, when I was a teacher, and we had a lesson where we were talking about the tragedy of the commons. And so we read a couple different pieces about it. One of them was by Tom Benthall, when he's talking about the experience of the Plymouth colony settlers in Massachusetts, and how their communal arrangement resulted in catastrophe for them. And to bring it home, I said, guys, I want you to think of driving down a freeway and take note of what you'll see when you look outside the window. It'll be littered with trash, floating bags from Walmart. Just 10 years worth of waste, flying out of the back of people's trucks, or people deliberately, throwing it out their windows. And there it sits forever and ever. And then I want you to think of going to a basketball game or a hockey game in Miami, or, you're going to see the Marlins play at the baseball stadium in Miami. What does a stadium look like when you show up? Spotless, absolutely spotless. What's it look like when you leave? Trash, filth everywhere. And yet you go to a game the next day and it's spotless again, because there is an incentive with private property, with private ownership, in order to maintain the land. There's also the judicial aspect, which is that you can find out what will happen if you decide to, dump motor oil
You sure will.
on your neighbor's property, right?
That's exactly right.
Right. And you would do the same, right? It's a reciprocal thing. So it's the defense, not only the ownership of private property, but the defense
of private property. And in terms of renewables, Mike, people learn their lessons, whether it's private landowners or communities. And I'll give you the example of Broken Hill, New South Wales, Australia. Broken Hill, the good people of Broken Hill, they're on the transmission grid in Australia. But they said, we got to have a backup plan because, if we get a lot of storms around here, the grid goes out, we need a backup plan. So they needed 36 megawatts of power. Basically, they had to have backup. So they went all in. They said, we are going to be the first carbon-free city in Australia. That is our goal. So they spent tens of millions of dollars on renewable energy, and they loaded themselves up with renewable energy. They had 53 megawatts of solar array. They had 200 megawatt load of wind. They had backup diesel for a battery for 50 megawatts. They had more. Capacity than they could possibly ever need. Well, lo and behold, a storm comes along and blows out the transmission grid. And so they needed to use the backup power. And guess what happened? It didn't work. The power would come on a little bit every day, and then it'd go off after a few minutes. The schools were closed. Refrigerators, people lost their food. Lockers full of meat, freezers full of meat. It was a disaster. And it was not because they didn't have the capacity. They had paid for the capacity, but it wasn't reliable.
Yep.
It was intermittency, and that's another big issue with renewables. And you learn these lessons, and the market teaches these lessons as we go along. And that's why when we talk about democracy and choice, whether it's in education or in energy, we talk about let's have laboratories of innovation and democracy to see, those people over in Broken Hill, that didn't work out so well. Maybe we want to rethink all the renewables and the emphasis on that. It is putting choice and ownership in people's hands to produce the best policy. And you can only do that if you control the land of the area which you live.
Yeah.
The people.
And yet you have a situation where opportunists, people who are really only after enriching themselves or advancing their life or their position, their status in some way, are advocating for renewable energies that are intermittent, that are unreliable, and who would have to be built to such an extent that it would cover a huge swaths of land. I mean, I threw up a picture of Al Gore here because I don't know how many times you died since you've been alive, Richard, but I think I've died twice since I've been alive. I think I died in 2012. I think I was supposed to die in 2020. And AOC just informed me that I'm going to die in 2030.
2030, yes, I think that's it.
But yeah, you have opportunists. I mean, that's really all I can say in the best case scenario, worst case scenario. I don't know what's worse. And someone who's ideologically, committed to the climate change, renewable energy agenda, or someone who is, just using it for political or personal reasons to advance themselves. But I want to get your thoughts on this. But a few months ago, I wrote about some of these people, and some of the people who are involved in pushing for renewable energies are the utilities themselves.
So, right.
Here in Wisconsin, we have what are called renewable portfolio standards, which are different for every utility company in the state. And starting from a base year, they say, okay, X company, you have to have 8% of your energy mix from renewable energy sources. This is what counts as renewable energy: wind, solar, biofuel. Okay. Y company, you have to have 10% renewable energy mix, blah, 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 blah. Well, you go down the list and you look at the requirements of these utility companies, and then you look at what their actual renewable energy mix is, and they are all above what they are required to do. Now, why would they build more renewable energy if it's less reliable, if it's more expensive? Why would they do that? Why would they do more than what they need to do? It must be because these are privately owned companies, these are investor-owned utilities, that they are making profit from this. Well, how are they making profit from it?
Got to be.
As it turns out, in Wisconsin and in most states, utility companies are state monopolies, sort of pseudo monopolies. They do have private shareholders. You can buy ownership shares of each of these companies on the New York Stock Exchange. If you did that 20 years ago, you're doing pretty well because they have made a boatload of money in that
Yeah. Oh,
same
yeah.
time period.
Yeah.
But the way they make their money is by building. When, let's say, We Energies builds a 100 megawatt solar farm, in Badger Hollow, or maybe Alliant owns that one. I can't remember, but 100 megawatt solar farm that is only going to produce 20% of its nameplate capacity, only 20% of its potential throughout a year. They're still going to do that because they don't get paid based on how reliable the energy they produce is. They don't get paid based on how, good their capacity factor is. Oh, you're using 99% of your capacity. We'll reward you, profits based on that. They are rewarded profit based on how much money you spend on building. So what do they want to do? They want to spend money to tear down the coal plants, to tear down the natural gas plants, to build the solar plants, and to build the wind turbines. And then they're going to go to the state regulatory agency, the PSC, the Public Service Commission, and they're going to say, we're helping Governor Evers achieve, the goal of net zero
Just
by 2040.
40.
And these things are going to last for decades and decades and decades. They'll last for 30 years.
We're
But then
good
they last
corporate
10 years.
citizens.
And then they last 15 years. And then say,
Yes.
oh, no, we couldn't have possibly expected that these things would only last 10 or 15 years. We're going to have to build new ones. And then they get profit on those too. That's exactly the reason why people who otherwise aren't compelled to do this, to follow through on this, are doing it.
And in the meantime, as they go out and build these solar farms, they're getting tax breaks to get the land to do it.
Yes, huge subsidy.
Huge subsidy. So on both ends, it's a distortion of the market.
Yeah, this is from a paper published by a man named Weisbach, which is a very important paper. I'll link it in the description once this goes live. But you look at solar and biomass over there on the left-hand side. For EROI is the energy return on investment. So basically, is the energy that these different sources produce, is it, bang for your buck? Are you actually, getting more value in energy produced than what you need to spend in order to build and maintain it? And for solar and biomass, it's not even close. There is no scenario in which those are economically viable. Wind can be. Keep in mind, this is done in Europe. So you have Denmark and you have, England, and Switzerland, Norway, with lots of wind turbines that are economical. But in other places, if you look at the buffered, not economical. You have to be in these really high wind areas near the poles if those are going to be economic. And then you see coal, in every scenario it's good. Gas turbines, every scenario it's good. Hydro is actually good. It's fine. It doesn't produce a lot of electricity because you're only using gravity in order to spin a turbine. And then, of course, on the right you have nuclear.
Clear.
There's no question here that this is the direction we should be going. We should be moving to the right.
We should moving to the right. That's right, and toward nuclear. And the time is right. I think I saw the biomass thing there, and yet driven by tax breaks, driven by farm state politics as well. We have 30 million acres set aside diverting farmland for ethanol.
Yeah.
And and in Europe now they're converting like 20% of their farmland for these purposes, helping to drive up food costs in the process, and no bang for the buck on the energy side. And this is the kind of thing that our energy policy has no rhyme or reason. It's driven by ideology and lust for power, and quite frankly, just crony capitalism in a lot of cases. And that's what we need to, when we talk about going to a pure energy policy, that's what we need to get rid of.
Yeah. Something else, or what's
I
next?
want to ask you a question before we leave on the utilities.
Yeah.
I've wondered this for a long time. How does broadband play into all of this? I've been working at the Lakeland Times for 20 plus years, and about every week, a press release will come out from a utility or the government saying, we're giving you this huge broadband grant, and we're going to connect all of Wisconsin, and everything's going. This has been 20 years now. They're still issuing those press releases. They're still connecting Wisconsin, and there's still large swaths of the state without broadband. What the heck is going on with that?
I wish I knew the answer, Richard. I have no idea. What I can't tell you is that, well, broadband is a monopoly that's exclusive to the telecoms industry.
There you
Okay.
go.
Like, think about, what's your hookup at your house? You only get one provider. You can't choose unless you go with Starlink, or unless you go with T-Mobile. They have, a remote thing as
Right.
internet service as well. But your hookup is your hookup, right? Same thing with the energy utilities, So we can talk more about how competition actually solves those issues of not having, multiple choices when it comes to broadband and energy. But for now, subsidies. So you said subsidies are a big part of this. Wind and solar are getting huge dollar amounts of subsidies, where it's actually possible for a wind turbine to still earn money when electric prices are negative. It's still possible. I think electric prices can be negative two cents or something per kilowatt hour, and a wind turbine can still be profitable. How that's only possible because of subsidies.
It's good. You're right. It's only possible.
And with ethanol, I mean, I remember as a kid driving around looking at all these gas stations, like, what's ethanol, Dad? Like, who's getting that? No one's getting. I don't know anyone.
Everyone's getting it.
I work a farm. I don't know any farmers who go get ethanol. So we're just producing corn fuel for no one to use. So can you, do you have an idea of the extent of subsidies?
I don't have a number, but I mean, it's massive. I will say this. I know that the overall total picture of subsidies, they always talk about the subsidies to the oil and gas industries, and those are substantial. I mean, depending on whose numbers you look, they could be from $10 billion to $50 billion. But it's at least 10 billion. But the renewables are squarely in that ballpark in terms of the total number of subsidies that are going out. And again, I think if you level the playing field and just take the subsidies away from all of them and put everybody on a level playing field, however the details of that are worked out, I think you will see. And then also with reasonable deregulation, so that you strip away the barriers to honest competition. You know what I think you see? I think you see wind and solar and biofuel not necessarily collapse, but cease to be significant factors in the present day until they're nascent industries. They're worth pursuing if private interests want to pursue the research, and I think it's worthy. And I think at some point in the future, they can perhaps produce a significant amount of clean energy without the detrimental effects. I mean, we even started to talk about I mean, windmills and the thousands and thousands of birds that they kill, and the permits that these wind companies get to exempt them from the laws against the bird strikes and bird kills, the noise from the turbines disrupting the migration patterns. I mean, there's so much, the amount of land that's gobbled up by renewables, solar farms and wind farms. We haven't even talked about that. Nobody talks about that because the media doesn't want to talk about that, but it's out there. And I think they've got to, if they weren't propped up by massive subsidies, then you would have a more significant demand for uh, fossil fuels, and then you would have a greater demand for the development of nuclear energy. And I think we should probably touch on nuclear and the big boogaboo about nuclear power, and is that it's not safe.
Yeah,
And
let's.
that's a lie that's been told by environmentalists, for many years. And of course they prop up, and I'm gonna forget again the name of the Japanese disaster,
Fukushima.
Fukushima and Chernobyl. Those are two major accidents. But when you look at the overall record, those are about the only two major accidents that occurred in 18,500 reactor years. There's a not, coal can't match it. No other industry can match the safety record of nuclear. It has never been unsafe. It's undoubtedly safer today. Now we've gone to small modular reactors. They are a tenth of a size, or a tenth to a quarter of the size of a traditional nuclear reactor. They are much. They can be put anywhere. They can, they got a lot of bang for the buck. They're lower cost. Communities can invest in them. They are self-cooling. They don't require additional water. They have lower powered cores, which makes them much safer. So you've even reduced the chance, which was minuscule, of a nuclear accident. Now with these SMRs, you've reduced it to almost nothing. And even in the event, of course, if the unthinkable happened and you did have a reactor accident, of course, they're small nuclear reactors, so your field of damage is much more limited than in a massive Chernobyl type event. The other issue that is raised against nuclear is, what do you do with the waste? We were at one time we were going to shoot it to Mars, but I guess the Martians didn't like that, so we're not going to shoot it to Mars anymore. But the fact is that, again, the United States brings up the rear. Nuclear, the spent nuclear fuel, which is the biggest problem, is 96% recyclable. And in most of Western Europe, and in particular France, which uses a lot of nuclear power, that spent fuel is recycled. The part that is reused for nuclear, then others for commercial commodities. It's only 4% that you have to really securely dispose of, which is easy to do in such small amounts. Now, in 1977, Jimmy Carter, another one of his brilliant moves, he said, well, the terrorists can get their hands on this spent nuclear fuel, so we're not going to allow recycling of the nuclear fuel. The rest of the world that embraced nuclear power did, but we didn't. Ronald Reagan did repeal that, but it really killed it. And so we don't have any nuclear recycling plants in the United States because of the whole onerous regulatory scheme. If you go to France and check into your hotel room and turn on the light, chances are that light bulb has recycled nuclear spent fuel in it. And the United States is way behind the curve on this. It is safe, it is economical, it is the future, as you were talking about, Mike. And I think, what's your take on that?
I think France is a really good example of how the U.S. could move towards, nuclear composing a much more significant, part of the energy mix. I think the number is about 70% of their electricity comes from nuclear. I know that South Korea has a fairly significant amount of nuclear, and obviously Japan does too. And Japan is probably one of the worst places in the world to put it, because you're at the conversion point of 5 tectonic plates. And Fukushima, that you had mentioned earlier, wasn't a reactor meltdown because things went haywire. It's because they got hit by a tsunami.
Yes.
And this tritium waste that came out of the Fukushima reactor, more people died from the evacuation than died from anything to do with the nuclear plant itself. No one in the nuclear plant died. No one was exposed to excessive levels of radiation that wasn't, easily treatable by administering iodine tablets. People died from the evacuation, from the panic that surrounds nuclear energy. And I have on the screen here a great book from Wade Allison, who's a professor emeritus of nuclear physics at Oxford. So he's retired now, but he has 2 books on radiation, and both of them are available for free. This is one of them. On the right-hand side, it looks at survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 2 places that had atomic bombs dropped on them. 0.4% of those people who survived died of radiation-induced cancer. 0.4%. 7.5% died from cancer from something else.
Yeah.
I mean, we that's a stunning figure.
It is. It is.
We have this idea that radiation, and there are all kinds of radiation. I'm being hit with thermal radiation from the sun right now. I'm being hit with UV radiation from the lights above me. I'm being hit by ultraviolet radiation from all over the place. There are many kinds of radiation, thermal radiation from the vents. Nuclear radiation, there are 2 or 3 different kinds. 2 of them dissipate within a few inches from the source, from
That's correct. Yeah.
heat from the source. And there's only one kind that really is harmful, and we have a very mistaken idea of what is actually a safe level of exposure. That tiny little white dot at the bottom, that's 1 milligray of exposure to radiation per month. That's recommended public safety. The green circle was the agreed upon safety level in 1934, 100 milligrays of radiation exposure per month. Never recorded any level of harm. And if I can do some quick math here, 0.1 times 10 times 100, 10 times 100 is 1,000 times more radiation. Your exposure to radiation could be 1,000 times greater than what is today recommended, with no adverse health effects. And if I go back really quickly there, the yellow circle is even greater than that. That's, what is that? 10, 20, 2,000 times greater. Yeah, 2,000 times greater than that. And you'll likely recover. I mean, talk about a sunburn. I mean,
yeah.
So radiation is much, much safer. If I'm just not convinced, based on, the significant events in history. Chernobyl, for example, I think there were 50 radiation-induced deaths from people who had very, very intense exposure to radiation for multiple days on end.
Right.
But with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the main cause of death was not radiation; it was fire and heat from exploding bombs.
Bombs, yes.
So let's wrap things up here, Richard. So our final policy is private property rights, or defending private property. Do you have any final thoughts on this? I guess anything that we've talked about.
Well, I do. I think in terms of going back to private property rights is central to all of this. Fortunately, with the election, Joe Biden's 30 by 30 program is going to come to an end. And that was, we're going to get 30% of all land and water in the United States conserved, quote unquote, by the year 2030. The Pelican River easement, 56,000 acres, was part of that. But the threat hasn't gone away because of the bureaucratic entanglement and subsidies. So when you get these large pieces of land that are controlled, they're essentially controlled by the government. And so you've got now what is called a national asset company. And a national asset company comes in. So when you've got an easement like in a large forest area, so you usually have, as part of the management plan, you have forest management, timber harvesting. You put that land, you give it public access, generally speaking, although a lot of the environmental groups that get these easements close them off to the public. And then you allow economic use of that land in a way that doesn't develop it permanently according to the easement. Not so with a natural asset company. You protect the natural asset, so you allow private interests to come in on public land or on publicly controlled land through an easement and say, we are going to invest in the natural assets. That is carbon sequestration or land and water conservation. So in other words, we're just going to preserve what's there, and there isn't going to be any economic use of this land. So that's one aspect of this whole 30 by 30. The other aspect of this is what we're seeing is that a lot of these easements are making exceptions and exemptions for solar farms or for renewable energy. And so the government is coming in now and in a lot of the new easements putting these kind of projects in place. So allowing government to control the land, the taking away of private property, defeats all sorts of individual liberty in what we want to do, including energy policy. And I think it's very important that in terms of a pure energy policy, of a real energy policy, that we never forget that we have to defend and preserve private property rights, because that's the cornerstone, because the person who owns the land will be a good steward of the land more than the government, more than the utility, more than the solar or wind farmer. The person that owns the land and puts it to the highest, best use of the land for the community and the person's sake will be the best energy policy from the ground up that we can pursue. And following on to that and leading out of that is we just simply have to unravel the energy bureaucracies, get rid of the regulations, all but the most essential. And there are very few of those, frankly, and then get rid of the subsidies and the tax breaks that distort the market. We have been held back. Our energy prices are catastrophically high. And energy then drives up the cost of everything else. But they're catastrophically high because not just because of all the government spending that Joe Biden and his administration did, which certainly drove inflation, but even before, the distortions in the market are preventing us from developing safe, efficient alternative like nuclear power or using fossil fuels to the best ability that we have. And it's driving prices up and lowering our standard of living.
I could not agree more, Richard. I could not agree more. I'm private property rights. I mean, to get a little bit more abstract, private property is the basis of a liberal society. We do not live in a feudal era. We have no kings. Private property is the basis of a free society, of the extended order. It is principally responsible for the entire system of capitalism and all the wealth that we have today. And it is fundamentally, property is an extension of yourself, right? That Lockean conception of mixing your labor with natural resources, originary homesteading. It is an extension of you, and to violate a private property rights is to violate human rights. When we talked a few days ago, I said property rights are human rights. They are one and the same. So I'm really glad. I don't know if you have a comment there.
I was just going to say, you made the point early on in this podcast that the mark of industrialization was, the efficient, productive use of energy. Energy is the lifeblood of the economy, and that is so true. And so, energy, the use of land is where energy comes from. It's going to be whoever controls the land controls the energy as well. And are we going to allow the people through private property rights to control the land and thus control our energy production and our energy future? Or are we going to let some elite government, bureaucracy, corporate nexus do it? I think it boils down to that.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, Richard, I think we'll cut it off there. Thanks very much for coming on.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, I had a great time.
I enjoyed it very much. And thank all of you. for tuning in and for listening. Talk to you again on Friday.